This is breaking news. General John Hyten is giving a warning to Russia and China and anybody else that dares to flex their muscles at us in the United States that we are going back to military buildup and to be battle ready. And I'm going to go ahead and play this for you, but this is breaking news. It seems that the Olympics postponed what was inevitable. I've been telling you folks that we're getting ready to go to war. Nobody wants to go to war, in their right mind anyway. But it amazes me as he's speaking just how many out there are licking their chops that enjoy going to war. Of course, they're not in their right mind. But we are headed towards World War III, people. And we're building up, and pretty much this general, high-ranking officer, this general, 4-star general, is giving a warning to Russia and China and anybody else. So let's go ahead and listen in.
So after the Cold War, our nation, especially the Department of Defense, we changed the way we thought about the world. And through the 1990s, what I grew up with, a threat-based approach to dealing with our adversaries, that threat-based approach to planning went away in the Department of Defense. In the 2001 Quadrennial Defense Review, the Department of Defense formally adopted a new approach to dealing with the threats, and we call it capabilities-based development and planning. The stated reason for this shift was a belief that there was no longer a specific threat. The basic concept was the military could no longer know what enemy would potentially propose future security threats to our national interests, and therefore the QDR stated that a capabilities-based model focuses more on how an adversary might fight than who the adversary might be and where a war might occur. The idea being that this is a functional analysis of operational requirements, and that will drive what we need to do. There are two problems with capability-based planning. First, especially with regard to the nuclear challenges, there were indeed specific threats. They did not go away. Our adversaries were also clear about those threats and their capabilities and their intent, and they announced them publicly. The threats were there, but we did not take them seriously. The second problem was the capabilities-based planning allowed our adversaries very good insight into our own capabilities and allowed them to develop asymmetric approaches to counter them. Nowhere is this clearer than our nuclear business. In a 2008 paper co-authored by then Secretary of Energy Samuel Bodman and Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, they both stated that the world has changed a great deal in the last decade and a half. The Cold War standoff with the Soviet Union is over, and Russia is no longer an ideological adversary. The same thought was reflected in the 2010 NPR that you heard Mr. Trachtenberg talk about just a minute ago. But Russia has been clear about their intent all along. Starting in 1999, Russia began incorporating simulated limited nuclear weapons use in large-scale exercises to de-escalate conflicts. The following year, in 2000, newly elected President Vladimir Putin signed a new military doctrine where the first time would allow for the use of nuclear weapons in response to large-scale aggression with conventional weapons in situations critical to the national security of the Russian Federation. That year, Russia increased its nuclear weapons budget 50%. This is 2000 now. And it began the Russian shift to the use of non-strategic nuclear weapons on the battlefield, which they continue to emphasize in their nuclear policy, strategy, and doctrine today. On May the 10th, 2006, in a public address to the Russian Federal Assembly, President Putin then announced sweeping modernization plans to its military, including nuclear forces through 2020. He said, I want to have the whole nuclear force 70% modernized by 2020. He said that in 2006. And in 2008 and 2010, we chose to consider them no longer a threat. Then in 2014, Russian Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin publicly stated that the modernization of the strategic nuclear force was going faster than anticipated, and they intended to modernize 100% of their strategic nuclear forces rather than 70% as previously announced. Today, Russia continues to develop and field an expanding set of nuclear capabilities, including the SSC-8 ground-launched cruise missile system that violates the INF Treaty. It has completed more than 50% of its planned road mobile force upgrade, as in the process of replacing their nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines as well. Russia is modernizing their heavy bombers to launch the advanced KH-101 and 102 cruise missiles, recently used in the conventional variant of this weapon in support of combat operations in Syria. China is also as well during this period. Is modernizing their heavy bombers to launch the advanced KH-101 and 102 cruise missiles, recently used in the conventional variant of this weapon in support of combat operations in Syria. China is also expanding and diversifying their strategic forces at the same time. China was watching the United States as well during this period. China currently has the most active and diverse ballistic missile development program in the world. It began the transformation 30 years ago, but significantly increased the pace over the last decade. The development of the H-6K nuclear-capable strategic bomber gives China the ability to deploy a nuclear triad for the first time. The addition of road mobile ICBMs, continued improvements to the Chinese nuclear submarines and associated sea-launched ballistic missiles, MIRV-capable ICBMs, and rapidly developing hypersonic glide vehicle capabilities underscore the evolution of Chinese strategic forces. Our adversaries are building and operate these strategic weapons not as a science experiment, but as a direct threat to the United States of America. And it is my job as a combatant commander to operate our current capabilities, to deter our adversaries, to advocate for future needs, and to provide military advice to our nation's leadership in order to best protect the United States and its vital interests. We, as a nation, have long desired a world with no, or at least fewer, nuclear weapons. That is my desire as well. The world, however, has not followed that path. Our adversaries have not reduced the role and salience of nuclear weapons, quite the opposite. They've done just the opposite. And so the only way I can see a change in our future is if the threat changes, if our adversaries change, and unfortunately, I see no immediate indications of that behavior. Nonetheless, I remain hopeful. But until that day comes, we have to be ready, and we must respond to the threat. So from a warfighter's perspective, there's tremendous consistency between the 2018 NPR and its predecessor. The biggest difference, as it is with the recent National Defense Strategy, is a return to great power competition and a return to threat-based planning. So we started the NPR with an assessment of the threat, a detailed assessment of the threat, using all the available intelligence, and based our approach on what our adversaries are doing today and the increased challenges of the future. We have to remember the strategic environment is dynamic. It changes constantly. Our approach to deterrence must be equally dynamic to address these threats. There is no one-size-fits-all model for deterrence. We have tried that, and it does not work. We must tailor our approach to every potential adversary. This tailored deterrence approach requires us to have flexible capabilities that include a broad mix of yields and modernized platforms to credibly deter the spectrum of adversaries and threats we face today and in the future. This is what the NPR directs and why it's critical to our future defense posture. While deterrence in the 21st century is based on the integration of all our capabilities across all domains, our nuclear triad will always provide the foundation of that deterrence. All three legs of our triad, as well as our nuclear command, control, and communications NC3 capabilities, provide the necessary diversity, flexibility, and resilience. The NPR reaffirmed the need to continue the comprehensive nuclear recapitalization programs initiated by the previous administration, including the Columbia-class submarine, the ground-based strategic deterrent ICBM, the B-21 bomber, the long-range standoff cruise missile, our nuclear stockpile, and infrastructure modernization programs. Additionally, it directs us to pursue a series of initiatives to strengthen NC3 and address 21st century needs and challenges. So as we evaluated our nuclear posture, in light of the threats we face, we found that it is strong today. We have everything we need to address the threats of today, but it is potentially lacking in the future. My worry is that if we do not act now, within the next decade, unlike me, one of my successors might not have the appropriate flexible and tailored capabilities to give the President of the United States options to adequately deal with the uncertain and evolving security environment. To ensure that no adversary, under any circumstance, believes that they can achieve an advantage through limited nuclear escalation or other strategic attack, the NPR recommends pursuing additional capabilities that provide that flexibility and bolster the credibility of our deterrent force. Specifically, it directs modifying a small number of existing submarine-launched ballistic missile warheads to provide a prompt, low-yield capability, as well as pursuing a modern nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile in the longer term. These new capabilities provide greater flexibility and enhance our deterrence. Now, it is important to note that we've had low-yield nuclear weapons in our inventory for a long time. We have them today. Today, they're exclusively air-delivered. Our bombers with their gravity bombs and cruise missiles are a critical piece of our force structure, but they cannot be everywhere, always at the same time. So after a year studying this challenge, we determined that there is a need for additional low-yield capabilities and other elements of our force to enhance the deterrence of limited nuclear use. If an adversary employs low-yield nuclear weapons on a battlefield, the only option that we have should not be just to go big. If they believe they can achieve their objectives through the limited use of nuclear weapons, then we risk a deterrence failure. A low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missile is survivable, prompt, and able to hold at risk targets that are heavily defended and enhances our deterrent. Additionally, these low-yield warheads would replace higher-yield warheads, keeping the U.S. within the New START limits. A nuclear sea-launched cruise missile is an assured response capability, adding to the range of credible options capable of being delivered at the timing and tempo driven by the conflict. Considering the fact that oceans cover over 70% of the globe, having a sea-launched cruise missile capability provides additional regional presence, strengthening our extended deterrent commitment to our allies. Pursuing a sea-launched cruise missile will take some time, but this effort will give room for the diplomatic process to work. And remember, as the Secretary said, it is our job to set the conditions for our diplomats so they can negotiate from a position of strength. But make no mistake, this does not lower the nuclear threshold. It's just the opposite. It increases the flexibility and capability of a response, raising the nuclear threshold for potential adversaries, making nuclear weapon use less likely. By having credible, flexible response options, I believe we'll never have to use them. However, if we don't have them, an adversary could underestimate the credibility of a U.S. response and begin a nuclear conflict that neither of us want. But if it comes, we have to be ready to respond decisively, and our adversary must know this. The best way to prevent conflict is to be prepared for it, to be prepared to impose unacceptable cost and deny any benefit that any adversary may perceive. That is deterrence. Ultimately, the modernization efforts for our triad and NC3, along with the additional supplemental capabilities, bolster our deterrence. They respond to the threat. Finally, the NPR defines and expands on what hedging against an uncertain future means for nuclear weapons. As witnessed over the past decade, the security environment can change quickly. Technology is constantly evolving. Adversaries are seeking to use these technologies to advance their own capabilities and put ours at risk. Hedging against an uncertain future means ensuring we are always ready, always confident, no matter what the future holds. This requires an agile, adaptable, deployed force and a responsive infrastructure, and it requires trained, educated men and women dedicated to the mission and postured for success. It also means having the flexibility to adjust the force with new capabilities and acquire systems quickly. So today, as I've said, our deterrence force is strong, powerful, and ready. But the pace of change in the strategic environment is rapid and demands that we adapt how we operate in order to stay ahead of evolving threats. And if we're not careful, I'm afraid 10 or 20 years from now, our deterrent capabilities will be at risk, and we cannot let that happen. What really worries me is this. I'm afraid our country has lost the ability to go fast. And if we're to be successful in modernizing our capabilities to respond to this threat, it's going to require some big changes in the way we operate. Our budget, requirements, acquisition, testing processes are all too slow. We have to get away from a culture that is risk-averse and empower our people. we have to move fast once again. First, we need a budget. It's a critical enabler for everything else. I was encouraged last week when Congress agreed to a defense budget framework that provides stable funding for the next 2 years. That'd be huge, but today we're still under a continuing resolution. A budget will be incredibly helpful. It's essential, but it's just one of the critical areas that have to be addressed. We also need to fix our requirements process. Why does it take years to build a set of requirements? Right now, I can grab 3 smart people, 3 of my subject matter experts, sit down with a piece of paper, and I can write down the requirements for the next generation missile warning satellite, the next generation ICBM. I already know what they are. Well, I don't need 3 years of analysis to do that. And next is the acquisition process. If you're working acquisition, you should be spending most of your time with industry, in the factories. Our acquisition process is challenged in a number of areas, but a big reason we are challenged in acquisition because our program managers spend most of their time in the Pentagon. Now, I love the Pentagon. I don't blame our program managers. The process is forced on them. They spend their time in the Pentagon because they have to get approval for everything. They're not authorized to make really any decisions. You can't execute a program that way. So we have to give our program managers the authority and responsibility to move fast and then hold them accountable. Additionally, we need a test process that is efficient and also moves fast. And fast does not mean reckless. It means we have to understand how to take risk and test. Sometimes that means failures, and that's okay. Failure sometimes is okay. This is how we learn. It's how we advance. A perfect example last week was Elon Musk and Spacex, the commercial side of the business. I think everybody in this room probably saw the launch of the Falcon Heavy and watched a cherry red Tesla go off into Never Never Land. It's the most powerful operational rocket in the world by a factor of 2. Only the Saturn V moon rocket, which my dad worked on, could deliver more payload to orbit. And then a little over 2 minutes after liftoff, the outer boosters broke away, returned to Earth, touching down almost simultaneously. Unfortunately, the center core missed its landing mark by 300 feet due to the failure of its 2 engines. But it's important to remember that this was a test flight, and prior to the test, SpaceX released a statement saying, and I quote, and listen carefully to these words, "Even if we do not complete all of the experimental milestones that are being attempted during this test, we will still be gathering critical data throughout the mission. Ultimately, a successful demonstration mission will be measured by the quality of information that we gather." That is exactly right. That is why we test. I'm not saying every time we test we should fail, just the opposite. But we have to remember that every test teaches us something, even when it doesn't go as planned. Finally, our operators need to understand how to take operational risk and be given the opportunity to do so when it comes. It's interesting. Risk is an inherent part of our business. When we go to war, it is the ultimate risk calculation every day. We need to empower commanders to take logical risk about how to employ weapon systems, how to accept weapon systems. Our modernization efforts will not be successful if we only address one of these issues. We won't solve the problem. We need to fix all of these things: budget, requirement, acquisition, test, risk, if we're to make a difference. But there is some good news out there. There are signs of improvement. As I stated earlier, Congress is moving on the budget. The Vice Chairman, General Selva, and the JROC are pushing to accelerate the requirements process. Deputy Secretary Shanahan and Undersecretary Lord are pushing on the acquisition business. This is good, but it's not just good, it's an imperative. We have to move fast because we have to respond to the threat. Ladies and gentlemen, this is all about the threat. So these are my thoughts. The rest of this day, you have 2 really amazing panels. Some of the best and brightest thinkers on nuclear weapons and deterrence are here to talk to you and to talk to you about nuclear capabilities, nuclear weapons, and the nuclear posture review. But whether you are new to this topic, just starting out in this field, or a seasoned professional that's been doing it forever like Frank Miller, I hope you take the discussions that you hear today forward. Add your own voice to this issue. We need you to carry the water and broaden and advance the discussions of the threats we face today and deterrence in the 21st century. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Hyten. You certainly have provided a strong case for the policy and the force addressed by the NPR. And I expect there'll be more than a few questions for the audience. So I invite those who have questions for General Hyten to line up behind one of the 3 microphones in the aisles. And when you're called upon, please provide your name and organization, and please state your question succinctly. Bob Vince.
Thank you, Bob Vince, SPA General. Thanks so much for being here. Thank you for your years of service and leadership, and thank you for the 184,000 personnel who work for you. Just a 2-part question, and really it's just about how do we go forward to get the funding in order to do 2 things. One, for U.S. response and balance to the hypersonic threat that you mentioned from China and from Russia to develop sea launch, air launch, ground launch systems, and what's that path to funding and development. And then second, for a coordinated and funded program, really, for meeting the need for a cyber-secure nuclear command and control system, nuclear and national command and control system.
You bet. So a set of complicated questions. So I'll start from our Secretary of Defense's discussion of affordability. And the 4-word answer from the Secretary of Defense is America can afford survival.
Sure.
And I think that's what it's all about. That's the basic. When you look at our budget, the nuclear budget is going to grow from 3.5% of our budget to somewhere around 6.5% of our budget over the year in order to pay for these kind of pieces. As we look at the emerging threat, we have to not only look at it from a weapons perspective and a deterrence perspective, but part of that deterrence structure is knowing what your adversaries are doing, knowing what those threats are. And right now we have challenges on the sensor side with hypersonics in particular. We have challenges on the sensor side with a number of different of the new threats that our adversaries are going. So right now we're working with the Missile Defense Agency to look at a system called the Midcourse Tracking System, MTS, that inherently has a capability to not only characterize a threat environment against the cold background of space, but if you look down at the Earth with those sensors, you can see those dim targets like hypersonics and other weapons. We need to be pursuing those sensor technologies, the characterization technologies, and then we have to pursue the nuclear command and control piece as well, as you talked about at the end. And one of the big challenges we have as we move forward in the future is that one of the only good things about our nuclear command and control posture right now, it is very cyber secure. Because when you built it in the 50s, there was not a significant cyber threat to worry about. So as we go and we look at GBSD coming online and the New Columbia class program, and we look at all those other, we have to upgrade those. So we're spending a lot of detailed time now looking with our industry partners at what will it take to actually provide a cyber-secure nuclear command and control, national leadership command and control capability as we go forward in the future. We have time to work those issues right now. We have put programs together in the budget to recommend going after those. It certainly has the highest attention. It is Secretary Mattis's #1 focus point in my business is the nuclear command and control piece, and so we're going after that in a big way. Thank you for the question.
My question goes to the new weapon, well, you wouldn't call it new, but the weapon you proposed for the low-yield Trident warhead. As I'm sure you know, about a decade ago, a similar program was proposed by the defense establishment to Congress for a conventional version, conventional warhead on Trident. That program was declined, rejected by Congress because of their concerns that there would be a discrimination problem. How would the Russians or someone else know that was coming at them as a conventional warhead because it's, of course, on a strategic missile? That problem seems to be, with this new concept, tenfold more. This weapon would actually be going at the Russians as opposed to the previous construct, which presumably would not have been. This one will be nuclear as opposed to conventional. It will be low yield, yes, but how would the Russians know that? So my question for you is, how do the Russians discriminate this low yield from a high yield, and therefore how do you prevent this from lowering the threshold for nuclear war, increasing the prospect that the Russians see this as a full-on nuclear attack and respond with a full-on retaliation? Thank you.
You bet. So as you walk through that, there's actually 2 pieces of that question. The first piece is about a requirement for conventional prompt global strike. We still have a requirement for that capability, by the way. STRATCOM still supports the development of that as an option for the President of the United States. I support that, going down that path as well. But as you said, 10 years ago when we looked at the Trident for doing that mission, that ambiguity was not a good ambiguity that we thought. This deployment on Trident of a low-yield nuclear weapon, an SLBM, does not have that problem, because if the Russians employ a low-yield nuclear weapon on the battlefield and they see something coming out of the Trident coming their direction, it's nuclear. There's no doubt it's nuclear. It's coming nuclear. They just went nuclear, and now there's a nuclear response coming back. The question is, how big is that response? And they will find out in about 30 minutes. They will. It won't be a significant issue for them to understand, because it is not a mass raid out of the middle of this country. It is not a mass raid out of the submarines. It is a focused weapon, and they will be able to characterize that and understand it. It does not have the ambiguity of that kind of piece. So it gives the president an option to respond in a way that would allow a better understanding of what is going on behalf of the Russians. So I look at it just the opposite the way you described it. I don't see it as escalatory at all. I see it as a smart, I see that as just a logical extension of our capabilities that we should have as warfighters to present to the President of the United States. Again, it shouldn't just be go big. You know, Henry Kissinger had a great point recently. He looked at that scenario and he said, if you don't have these low-yield capabilities, what you're doing is you're putting the President of the United States in a position where his only choices are surrender or suicide. That's not a good place to be. Those aren't good choices. I don't like either one of those. So we need these capabilities to provide that, not surrender, not suicide, but provide an appropriate, tailored response to the situation that is there. So thank you for your question. Sir.
Michael Gordon, Wall Street Journal. Sir, Secretary Mattis has suggested that the new SLICM might potentially be a bargaining chip to correct the Russian INF Treaty GLICM violation. The Nuclear Posture Review suggests that something more might be required, that there might not only have to be a correction of the INF Treaty violation, but the Russians would have to reduce their tactical nuclear weapons as well. And even then, it's not specific that the U.S. might give up the SLICM in that context. Is this system a bargaining chip potentially for INF? And can you put a little flesh on what the plans are for fielding, deploying, developing this system? Because if you don't go ahead with it and there is no IOC, it's probably not going to be a very useful bargaining chip.
So I think I never want to speak for Secretary Mattis, because that could get me fired, and that's a bad thing. But I did see his response yesterday to a similar question, and I know from having talked to him that he doesn't like the term bargaining chip, and I don't like the term bargaining chip either. These capabilities that we're talking about are responses to the threat that's out there. Now, if that gives our diplomats the ability to then negotiate with our adversaries, negotiate with the Russians, and come to a place where we don't think that those weapons are good for our country, their country, or for the earth, and we can negotiate those, that's great. But that's not why we're building those. We're building those as a response to the threat. Now, I hope that our diplomats can use them to effectively walk down that path. Now, as regard to INF, we're also proposing research and development into ground-launched capabilities. That's also part of the President's budget, going down that path. Research and development is not prohibited by the INF Treaty. What is prohibited is the employment and deployment of those weapons. Russia has deployed those weapons now. That's what violated the INF Treaty. So we're proposing that we'll go down that research development place. If they don't come back into the fold in INF, then we'll be prepared to respond accordingly as we go forward. It's going to be a very complicated discussion as we go forward, but the capabilities we propose are to respond to the threat and then hopefully give our diplomats some room to maneuver. Fair enough, sir? Thank you.
General, thank you. I'm Alexei Fomenko, Second Secretary at the Russian Embassy. You spoke a lot about Russia, and it is also mentioned a lot in the NPR. So I wanted to ask you two questions. First, how did you make the determination that Russia was increasing its reliance on nuclear weapons, especially since in the unclassified documents, the 2014 nuclear military doctrine says that in fact we are decreasing the reliance and that we are introducing non-nuclear deterrence measures, much in line with what the United States was doing at the moment. And the second question is, how can Russia be expanding the nuclear arsenal given the START treaty limits, which I think the State Department has recently said Russia was observing? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll say there's an interesting dichotomy in our nation. We call it the say-do gap, where you say one thing but you do another. That's called a say-do gap. So we listen very closely to what your president says. We listen very closely to what your leadership say, and then we watch very, very closely of what your nation does. And when we put those two things together, we see two things. We see a very mixed message on the say side, but we also see a commitment to full modernization of the capability and a commitment to the building non-strategic nuclear weapons and a commitment to employing a new doctrine of nuclear weapons that is very dangerous, we think, in the overall scheme of the world. And because of those pieces, and we put them together and we watch very closely, we have to consider those a threat. I'm a military officer. I'm not a politician, thank goodness. And as a military officer, I have to look at what is real. I have to look at what is there. So we watch. We watch the tests. We watch the capabilities. We watch all those pieces come together, and we understand the employment of those forces in a stated doctrine, and that's how we characterize the threat. That's why we recommend to our political leadership how we have to respond to that threat. That's where we come down that path, sir. Thank you.
Hi, sir. James Drew from Aviation Week. So a couple of things. Here's a free one for you. Have you asked SpaceX for some recallable ICBMs? That might be an interesting one. But should China be part of any future arms reduction negotiations? And should the Air Force be stepping up and flying those Reapers with the forward-looking sensor balls that you mentioned?
So I guess there are three questions there. Number one, SpaceX does not like when I talk to them about weapons on top of their rockets. Just not a big thing for them. The second piece of the question was, so the China piece is, I'm not a diplomat. I'm a military officer. I have to deal with the Russia threat, the China threat, the North Korea threat, the Iranian threat. That's what I deal with. But as an American, I would like China to be part of any discussion on the future. I would like China, look at the missiles that China is building. I would like to understand China's role in intermediate nuclear forces. I would like to understand what those kind of pieces are. I would like to have an aggressive dialogue between the State Department and the Chinese Foreign Ministry and those kind of pieces. I would like to have all those things happen. That's not my job. My job is to deal with the world that it is, to deal with the world that could be, and be prepared for those kind of things and allow, ma'am, how are you? The State Department to walk down that path, but I really want them to go. And then as far as how do you use Reapers, that's really not my lane. I don't know if you've looked at the Stratcom force structure or not, but I don't have any Reapers in the force structure. So that's really a broader question for the Air Force. I am informed on that, but it's bad to stand on stage with media in the audience and just give you a wild-ass response. That doesn't mean anything. All right.
Good morning, sir. Harris with Inside the Air Force. And if I could quote from the NPR just to make sure I get the words right. It says DoD is going to prioritize R&D funding for rapid development of nuclear delivery systems, alternative basing modes.
Could you back up?
I'm
sorry. Could you back up and start and just slow down a little bit?
Yeah, sorry.
Because there's just an echo here. So
it says DoD is going to prioritize R&D funding for alternative basing modes, missile defense systems, and things like that. So are the alternative basing modes, can you dig into what options you're looking at for that? Are they going to be part of the ongoing GBSD and LRSO modernization programs? I'm just looking for a little more insight into that.
You bet. So as you walk down, it's important to know that the NPR, when it talks about the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile, it does not say submarine-launched cruise missile. It says sea-launched cruise missile, because we want to look at a number of options. Everything from surface DDG-1000s into submarines different types of submarines, fast attack submarines, SSGNs, SSBNs, look across those boards and make sure we understand what it is. That's what the President's budget has requested us to go look at those platforms, and we're going to walk down that path. When you look at the other capabilities that we're talking about for defensive systems, we're looking at multiple basing options for defense, air, ground, sea. We're looking at a number of different options for looking at the defense side. And then from the ground-launched cruise missile capability that we're going to explore the technology for, we're going to walk down that. That tends to be a focus on the ground-based system, but we'll have a ground-based element, a sea-launched element, and we'll look at those capabilities as an entity. We have not made any commitment to deploy any of those at this point. We've just recommended in the President's budget that we begin to explore those technologies. Thank you.
Peter Sharfman, Miter Corporation. The NPR in general and your remarks this morning focused almost entirely on capabilities that will be available for your successor or your successor's successor. Given the threat-based approach to planning, do you see a need, and is there money in the budget to increase alert levels or be prepared on short notice to increase alert levels, to have higher levels of training, operations, maintenance, and so forth?
You bet. So it's a fair question. I can tell you in the nuclear posture review, we looked at those options. You have to understand that the submarine force today is on alert. The ICBM force is on alert. The bombers are not on alert, have not been on alert since 1992. The bombers are the most flexible leg of the triad, though, and they give us a lot of capability, both from a deterrence perspective and a messaging perspective. Because if we choose to raise the alert level of the bombers, in today's day and age, you really can't hide that from your adversary. And so that sends a significant message of an increased posture of the United States. So we looked at those kind of things, looked at the various elements that we have across the force structure, and decided we like where we are right now. We believe it provides the proper deterrent approach and the proper ability to look at different options for the future and where we want to go in the future. But we still leave that decision with the President, the advice of the Secretary of Defense and me, about when and where we would want to raise the alert force of our bomber capability. Thank you, sir.
Hey, Justin Doubleday with Inside Defense. During his House hearing this week, Admiral Harris from PACOM had mentioned that with the SLCM and the low-yield SLBM, may need to look at the command and control for those weapons, and kind of said maybe the C2 needs to go with the COCOMs over STRATCOM. Can you say whether DoD is looking at an option like that?
So we've been directed in the nuclear posture review, and the implementer will be coming out shortly. But we've also, if you read the language that's in the President's budget, that's one of the options that we have to look at. What is the appropriate command and control for these kind of weapons? What is the employment? In many cases, it depends on which platform it's on, and how do you want to set up that command and control structure. I've had the conversation with Admiral Harris, and that'll be part of the trade space as we go through. So let me walk through where his thinking is if you think, if we go down the path of a surface capability versus a subsurface capability, and we go down a path, the current command and control in theater is all through the geographic commands to get to those platforms. If we go into the nuclear submarines, that command and control is all through STRATCOM. It's all through me. So that part becomes part of the trade space about how do we do that? What does that mean to the overall orders that have to go through? Does that order come from the President to me to the force? Does it come from President to PACOM to the force? That's the discussion we have to have. So that will be the trade space as we go through, which is why the budget is written the way it is for us to explore those concepts. All right.
Sir, if I can ask you the final question. Many of the questions that we've had have been appropriately about policy and capabilities. NPR was focused on. A question fitting to this venue, could you comment on the importance of education, particularly deterrence education, to the successful implementation of the NPR?
You bet. I'd love to talk about that.